Allen's birthday. And we want to thank Reverend Allen for being a part of this panel conversation on such a significant day. Thank you, Reverend Allen. So we'll start the presentation. All right, just to, all right. So tonight is Tab Art Center Nonprofit Law and Policy Town Hall. All right, just to tell you a little bit about our 501c3, Tab Art Center Nonprofit was basically founded by the individuals who own the Artist Block, which is myself, Patricia Schuler, and Darlene McClinton. Our mission is to bring quality art education and art therapy to the community and overall engagement. Since we have been in COVID, we have directed our attention towards the community in a variety of different ways, as these panel discussions reflect. So we have been focused on what the community needs and giving back and discussing inequities that exist within our community. So some of the events that we've already had are the street mural, Say It Loud, which you can see on Lindsay Street. That was sponsored by Arts Greensboro as well as Creative Greensboro. And we'd love for you to come out and check that out. We also do online classes. We do art classes as well as visual art professional development classes for all artists. And right now we have a business of art class that we'll be offering the first week in November. So if you're interested in starting a business, or if you're an artist who needs to kind of get their information, all of their paperwork together, please sign up for that class. You can find that on our site, tabartcenter.org. Some of the other discussions that we've had in the past, our first Tab Talk was police reform. And we had a very energetic conversation about what's going on. Of course, as you can see, we had the chief of police there, Judge Laura Cubbage, Councilwoman Mary Kay, as well as Reverend Allen's son, the community activist, Irving Allen. Also, we've discussed inequities that exist within the art community. And we had guests as the director and president of Arts Greensboro, Laura Way, the director of Creative Greensboro. So essentially, we just discussed the inequities that really do exist within the art community in Greensboro. And if you can find all of these discussions on our YouTube page. We also offer art therapy classes, and generally pre-COVID, we do a summer camp. So each year we do a summer camp, usually is located at Shiloh Baptist Church. And we do a film camp for the teenagers and a theater camp for the younger children, and they love it. So once this is all over, come and see us for the summer camps, as well as our art therapy that we do with nursing homes. We do beautification projects, as well as art, dance, music therapy. So we generally focus on Alzheimer's patients, but we work with all senior citizens. Okay, so a little bit about me. I'm going to actually take this PowerPoint presentation, and when we're done, everyone who has viewed or participated with this, I'm going to send this to you so you can look and see all the information. So I won't read everyone's bio completely, but I'll just do a very quick synopsis so that we can get to the conversation. We only have a short period of time, and I want us to be able to address everything that we've been discussing. Again, my name is Sunny Gravely Fouché. I'm the moderator tonight. I am the executive director of Tab Art Center Nonprofit, one of the co-owners of the Artist Block. We have been in existence since 2016. I'm a graduate of Howard University as well as Pratt Institute. I've taught several years in the school system, and now I'm working with the community through our nonprofit. All right, our next guest is Reverend Steve Allen. Reverend Allen In September 2011, Shiloh Baptist Church extended the call to Reverend Allen to serve as its 11th pastor. He has been a lifelong member of Shiloh and has served multiple roles in community service organizations. He is a lifelong member of NAACP, serves as executive director for the North Carolina State Conference of the NAACP and as the parliamentarian of Greensboro NAACP. He is also a life member of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity, Inc., and is a member of James Vincent Dudley High School. In 1988, he was the first Black elected to a Superior Court judgeship in Guilford County. Prior to assuming the pastorate, he was engaged in a law practice that handled civil and criminal trials in North Carolina, state and federal courts. Celeste Brandon was born in Reedsville, North Carolina, and raised in McLeansville, North Carolina. Celeste has 3 daughters. She is retired from the United States Air Force. Celeste's 19-year career with the Air Force included being stationed in Saudi Arabia, Japan, North Carolina, Texas, North Dakota, South Korea, and Delaware. Her positions included military postal clerk, non-commissioned officer in charge, information management, non-commissioned officer in charge, knowledge operations management, and several other positions. All right, and then we have Dr. Zitty, will you say your name so I do not butcher it? Oh my
God. Of course, my full name is Zitobile. My last name is Nxumalo. The X is a click, but most people call me either Zitty or Dr. Z.
I appreciate that, Dr. Z. I'm gonna get it together. I always just call you Zitty. I love you. All right, so Zitty was born in Swaziland, South Africa, and moved to Greensboro, North Carolina when her family was just 4 years, when she was just 4 years old. She grew up passionate about authenticity, stories, dance, and leadership. Dr. Z was recognized as one of the Triad Business Journal's 40 leaders under 40 and received a full scholarship to attend Google Search Inside Yourself Leadership Institute in New York. Her SIYLI experience strengthened her ability to approach inner development and leadership as the convergence of emotional intelligence, mindfulness, and neuroscience. As a freelance writer, Dr. Z's work has been featured in several publications, including O. Henry Magazine, Triad Beat, Black Business Inc. Magazine, and Huffington Post. She has also authored speeches, op-eds, and research-based web content on a variety of topics, including leadership, spirituality, and culture. All right, we have Justin Outling. Justin Outling is a partner at Brooks, Pierce, McClendon, Humphrey, and Leonard, LLP in Greensboro, practicing in business litigation and white-collar criminal defense. He is an alumnus of the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, as well as the Duke University School of Law. Prior to joining Brooks Pierce, Justin served as a federal law clerk to Judge William L. Osteen Jr. and the Middle District of North Carolina in Greensboro. Often recognized for his significant professional and personal accomplishments, in 2018, his peers selected him for the Inclusion in Business North Carolina's Legit Elite in the Young Guns category. He is also a councilman with, Justin is also a member of the Greensboro City Council and serves as the Greensboro community in a number of roles, including as a board member of Carolina State Park Preservation Greensboro, as well as the co-chair of the Board of Visitors for the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. And then we have Jan Pritchett. Jan is a trial attorney at the Greensboro law firm of Slosser and Pritchett, PA. Jan is certified as a specialist in state and criminal law by the North Carolina State Bar. He has served as co-chair of the Criminal Law Board of Specialization, chair of the criminal section of the North Carolina Bar Association. He also formally served as a member of the Board of Governors for the North Carolina Bar Association. Pritchett takes his chosen profession very seriously and works to stay abreast of the latest changes in the law by maintaining memberships in a variety of professional associations and serving on the NC Bar Association Board of Governors. He is a board certified specialist in both state and federal criminal law, which means he can help regardless of whether you have been charged by North Carolina or in federal court. right, thank you. And we were going to have Senator Gladys Robinson out, but she has talked to Reverend Allen tonight, and so he's going to be representing the two of them. And this is a little bit more information about Senator Gladys Robinson. All right, we want to go ahead and get this thing started. So my first question is really towards, hold on one second. My first question is, what is the difference between a law and policy? Attorney Jan Pritchett, could you start with that particular question, please?
So Attorney Pritchett?
I think I just turned my mic on. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes, we
Yes,
can.
okay,
you're
so
unmuted now.
policies differ from law in that policy would just be a set of guidelines that some organization, oftentimes a governmental organization or police department, might follow. Of course, policy doesn't have the effect of law because law would be enforceable in the court system. Oftentimes, policies may lead to the formation of laws if it is a policy that is going to be ongoing.
Thank you. Reverend Allen, the same question goes for you. What is the difference between a law and a policy?
I think the policies pretty much evidence a desired outcome of what a particular state, body, community values and what it champions. So for instance, if you want to build affordable housing, then you advocate for the idea of affordable housing, and then you establish methods or procedures to achieve it. And one of those outcomes may be laws that will help you to allow that. For instance, in a community, or in this instance, let's use crime, since we're talking about law and policy and community. In the instance of crime, for instance, if you have a outbreak of a series of crimes, I'll just use one that we've already experienced, perhaps somewhat disadvantageously in our community, and that is one, let's say, of drug use. If you've had a serious problem with drugs, then you may advocate for measures to try to deal with that. And whatever your view of what you want to accomplish would be a policy to achieve that. We've done that sometimes to the disservice of a community by passing laws, so that the idea of deterring someone from causing harm is good. But if it's applied you adopt a law, the law itself may be draconian in the outcome. The laws are the binding rules that govern the conduct or behavior of people in that particular community or society.
Thank you, Reverend Allen. Justin, as a councilman, what is the difference between a law and a policy?
Yeah, well, I think Attorney Pritchett and Reverend Allen captured it beautifully. The way I think about it is in the context of what a law or a policy would look like in my household, where we have 2 elementary age school children. And so we have a policy that our kids can't get dessert if they don't finish their meals. That is something that's enforceable in our house. It always applies in our house. It's a household rule. That's like a policy. By contrast, if it were a law, it would look like when they go to their grandparents' house, they likewise would not be able to have dessert until they eat their meal, because it would apply beyond just the orbit of our household and essentially our household organization. And so that's similar to the way policies operate versus laws. The police department has a whole host of policies that prohibit certain activities by police officers. Those are rules for our police department, and when those rules are violated, there should be consequences. However, one consequence will never be being able to go in a court of law, because courts are not in position to enforce internal policies. By contrast, they enforce laws that are of more general application. So that's the way I think of it, at least in a kind of non-lawyer term or framework.
Thank you, Justin. I like that example. Thank you very much. All right, so the next question is, briefly explain how federal, state, and local laws are formed. How do they affect current cases? And how do they affect the prosecution of certain cases? Attorney Pritchett, do you mind starting off again?
No, I kind of looked at that question, kind of thought about it, and it takes me back to civics class. And Justin would certainly be more apt to discuss it on a very local level, although I'm sure he's apt to discuss federally and state as well. But federally, of course, we have two houses. We have the United States House of Representatives and the United States Senate. A bill would have to pass in both branches and then get signed by the President of the United States in order to become law. That's how federal law is created. In the state, we have a similar mechanism in our General Assembly. We have two houses, of course. We have the House and the Senate. And same process, once it passes both chambers, then the governor would sign whatever the measure is into law. In terms of, I think the second part of your question was how laws affect people, and that's kind of broad. However, everyone is bound by the law, and regardless of race, color, creed, sexual orientation, everyone must follow the law. I think where we run into difficulty is when laws are not necessarily applied equally. And I think about it because we're talking, about crime and policy, just the way that the police sometimes carry out their jobs. You might get stopped for an expired, and I'm not saying this necessarily locally, but in a lot of communities, and even sometimes here, a person might get stopped for an expired registration tag, which is a violation of the motor vehicle law in the state of North Carolina. If you get stopped on one side of town, you might get a ticket and go on about your way. If you get stopped in another section of town, although the initial stop deals with this one issue, you may get asked if you have any drugs in your car, or you may get asked if it's okay if they search your car. And that is an example where the laws are on the book and they should be applied equally, but sometimes laws are not necessarily enforced equally, or the carrying out of those laws may not be carried out in the same way for everyone.
Councilman Outling, would you mind also answering that question from your perspective?
Yeah, so Attorney Pritchett, in terms of a civics lesson and civics teacher, he did a wonderful job explaining it and 100% accurately. I would also add that it's important to understand that persons who sit on city councils and create essentially local laws, as well as those who serve at the state level and the federal level, they are just regular people, including persons that don't have a background or experience developing laws. And so that's important to understand in several regards, including that sometimes the laws are not especially well written, right? They don't achieve the desired outcome. Moreover, to Attorney Pritchett's, one of his lattermost points, oftentimes they allow a great amount of discretion where officers or other persons involved in actually applying the law are given an opportunity to either not apply the law or to apply the law, or to apply the law in one way here, in a different way elsewhere. And so, with that discretion and with, laws oftentimes not achieving their desired outcome, it could affect people's daily lives with regard to how the laws apply to them, as well as by contrast, how it may be applied to others.
Thank you. Reverend Allen, do you have anything to add to that?
I think that they've given you a great indication, particularly I think what the commonality is many times laws are adopted perhaps for a good reason, but it's the application of the law or enforcement of the law that turns to be problematic. And then, of course, there are some laws that are passed that are just simply bad laws. They're passed for bad reasons, and those reasons cause much harm in the life of a community, state, or nation. And so that gets to that policy question again. That's where advocacy comes into play, as those laws must be addressed with the legislators, or if there are ordinances with the city council, as the case may be, to try to make sure that those laws are repealed and the laws are adopted that are more fair in terms of the treatment of the citizenry. Obviously, the downside, as we see, is that there are some laws that can be passed that can protect people, bad actors, somebody called bad actors of whatever persuasion. So we see where the state might go, and we saw this recently, where the state passed laws to protect hog farmers to the detriment of people that own land in the same communities, where they had to smell the waste and the manure, and yet they get the legislator, because they were trying to protect a certain industry, granted certain immunity from suit. Now, for those persons who had to smell that manure and cannot sit out in their yards, and who cannot enjoy their homes, many of whom have been in their families for 50, 75 years, that is a hardship. The same way with the application of criminal laws, when you have uneven enforcement of laws, is just as Jan gave an example. When I was young, it was a law against riding mini bikes before you were a certain age. And I was riding my mini bike on the street. That was a no-no. You weren't supposed to ride your mini bikes on a public street. Well, the police officer down the street, who happened to be a police officer in the community, caught me riding a bike on the public street. Instead of hauling me down and taking me juvenile and making me a juvenile delinquent, he made me get off that mini bike, push it back home, and he talked to my parents. And that's the difference in discretion of what can happen on one side of town versus what can happen on another side of town, and the enforcement of the law.
Thank you, Reverend Allen. That actually brings us to the next question. Are there any laws that specifically address racial justice? And if so, who decides if this law applies to a case? So this is similar to what we're talking about. I'll start with Justin this time. Councilman Outling?
Yeah, that is a terrific question. In many ways, almost every single law involves race, because that's the structure upon which our country in many degrees was founded. But more specifically, there are a number of laws that are designed to address issues or problems in connection with race. And so, for example, you have constitutional amendments that provide for the franchise for women and prohibitions against slavery. All of those things are, in fact, laws. More contemporary examples, you have certain prohibitions in police policies, and, for example, at state level, that removes certain discretion that officers might have to stop persons that they otherwise would not stop but for their race, but it's a legally valid stop. You have laws that prohibit that type of conduct. So there's a whole host of laws that address racial issues, whether you look at that in a broad way, recognizing the nature in which our country was founded, or in a much more specific way with some contemporary examples I've just outlined.
Okay. Attorney Pritchett, and I am thinking about, I guess, all of the cases that we've seen in the news that seem very obvious that they have something to do with race, but yet it doesn't seem as though race is being acknowledged or connected to any of these cases. Attorney Pritchett, could you go into a little bit more detail about how these laws are actually, who says that this is a race-related crime?
Okay, there are hate crimes federally, and if a person is targeted because of their race, then there are federal hate crimes that apply. We also have similar laws statewide. But one of the things, one of the viewers chimed in about the 14th Amendment, I think Mr. Wright did, and that is something that brings an issue to the forefront that we deal with from time to time in criminal courts. And that is, there was a case, Batson versus Kentucky, that dealt with the use of peremptory strikes. If anyone has ever seen a jury trial, the prosecutor and defense attorney can exclude jurors from serving on the jury, but it needs to be a race neutral reason for that person's exclusion. And I know particularly when Steve was a Superior Court judge, I'm sure he heard some Batson motions. I see Laura Cubbage is on the call, who's running for the Court of Appeals, who's still a Superior Court judge. In terms of enforcement, if a Superior Court judge or a district court judge district court judges have some jury trials, but in terms of criminal jury trials, if a prosecutor, for example, were striking all Black jurors, then the defense attorney would raise a Batson challenge and require the prosecutor to give a race neutral reason. If the prosecutor couldn't give a race neutral reason, then the Superior Court judge would be empowered to take action in that matter. So that's just one that I think of. The other thing, just kind of in the vein of jury trials, one thing that has been frustrating for me, I know Steve when he was a lawyer and Justin has likely experienced it, is when minorities don't want to participate in the jury system, trying to make up every reason in the world not to serve and then cry that they don't have, or we don't have, a jury of our peers. But a jury of our peers begins with each one of us being willing to serve, because otherwise we can't get a fair trial.
Okay, that's a good point. Reverend Allen, did you have anything else to add to this particular question?
Well, I'm a little older than Jan and Justin, so when I started trying cases, we couldn't get Black jurors, and it was very rare that we would ever have a Black juror. And if we were able to get a Black juror, it was probably only one, because even though Batson was decided while I was in law school, in the actual real world of practice, the exclusion of Black jurors took place each and every day in our judicial system, in our legal system. I will tell you that, of course, there are other statutes that have been designed. The 14th Amendment deals with the equal rights under the law, equal protection under the law's due process. You also have 1981 and 1983 actions that I used to do civil rights discrimination work, of course, that prohibit discrimination on account of race and some other grounds. You also had, since this the inception of local state statutes, anti-hate crimes based on race and now sex. But we also know that these laws are very difficult sometimes to have enforced in our society, particularly because many times, as you see, when I started practicing law, I'm gonna call this like I saw it. There was a time when, let's just look at reality. The reality is that we have never been able to get a Black judge in the federal Eastern District of North Carolina, never. Even though we've had extremely well qualified individuals who have been nominated, we've never been able to get a Black to sit on that bench. And the question would be why? And it's nothing but race. We know that the judicial system at the time, the reason I got to be a Superior Court judge in North Carolina, prior to that time, there were laws in place that made it very difficult for Blacks to win. Superior Court seats because they had to run statewide. And it was almost a death knell for us getting elected. So it was only by the recarving of legislative districts and judicial districts that we were able to see the advent of Black Superior Court judges of some level in the state of North Carolina. And when I was elected in 1988, there were 8 of us that got elected at one time in those districts, and got a couple bonus ones who got elected down in Wilmington and in a smaller town setting. And so we ended up about 10 of us that changed the complexion of justice in the state of North Carolina. So race has always been a factor. Jan said that. Let me stop there and let some other questions be asked.
All right.
Let me pose a question that was written in the chat, since it is about law and policy, before we move on to additional questions about ethics. Larry Wright asks, if a policy is broken by the police, why are they not charged under the law?
Attorney Pritchett, could you answer that question?
Well, policies are not necessarily law, so that might answer the question. If a police officer, though, violates the law, they should be prosecuted under the law if what they violate is a specific criminal statute. Well, let me just chime in too. I believe, well, I know from personal experience that police officers have been fired for not following policy.
All right, and I see that he just asked the follow-up question to see, is policy under any law?
Let me,
Is that-
policies may be adopted. Jay, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead, Steve.
Okay, many times the policies are a result of the United States Constitution or federal decisions that determine the parameters of what police officers can and cannot do. And so once the United States Supreme Court comes down with certain constitutionally protected rights and identifies those rights with a bright line so that everyone knows what those rights are, then the policies become adopted by the police department so they can try to comply with the constitutional decisions of the United States Supreme Court or of other federal courts that may be binding upon the land. So policies may influence the adoption of laws, and policies may be a result of laws that have been adopted. But the policies are not actually laws themselves. So it gets you into why they are not enforced criminally unless they violate a constitutional standard. And then if the violation of the policy itself is in violation of a known protected constitutional right, then it may be a criminally prosecution, at least from a federal side, allowed.
And I know that it's a lot of confusion with police not being held accountable for what seems to be blatant crimes, where everything seems like it's evidence to state that this person should at least be have criminal charges against them. And a lot of times it seems like the police officers may get fired, or if even that happens, but it doesn't seem as though anyone is actually going to jail. So I think that may have something to do with this follow-up question that Larry has.
And I would add that I think, Sonny, your observation is spot on. I recall probably 4 or 5 years ago, we had a situation in which an officer, in my view, both as an attorney as well as a layperson, assaulted a man on his grandmother's porch. I mean, he assaulted and battered the man. He didn't have, in my view, a legal basis to touch the gentleman. As a matter of policy, it violated departmental policy what he did. And consistent with that, I and others on the Greensboro City Council helped provide a measure of accountability, notwithstanding the fact that he quit before he could be fired. We took action to appeal to the board that provides licensing for officers to help ensure that he wouldn't be able to be hired by any other police department across the state of North Carolina. And so that's a policy thing. That's the city council doing what it can to hold that person accountable for his bad conduct. Separately, I and others also asked the district attorney at the time to review his decision not to charge that officer for what was an assault or a battery. The district attorney at that time declined, in my view, to apply the law to that particular officer. And so part of what I think goes to the question is accountability and who makes the decisions about application of the law or the policy. And so in this situation, the city council did what it could, what it had the power to do, hold him accountable in his role as an officer and ask the district attorney to take action. But with regard to application of the law, which is separate in addition to policy, that decision was made by the district attorney, not the city council. And while good people of different minds could have different views about whether or not the law applied in that circumstance, it's a very different question, law versus policy, and why are we seeing outcomes that appear to be dependent upon one's race?
Thank you. That I feel as though that really kind of hit what I believe Larry was trying to say, and I'm glad that you gave an example, especially specifically an example that has happened in Greensboro. And we're going to go ahead and move on because we do have a specific case that we want to talk about of injustice, and I want to get everyone's opinion about this and how she needs to move forward, because this also, I believe her case has a lot to do with whether or not someone decided to press charges or not, and how that went forward. But I'm going to let her speak for herself. Okay, so the next question actually is posed to Dr. Z. As an individual who has trained police officers and corporations about ethics, can you explain what unbiased, I'm sorry, I'm looking at the wrong. Could you explain what unconscious bias is and how it affects our criminal justice system?
Sure. Well, first, I'm really enjoying listening to the conversation. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a law expert by any means. I'm not a policy expert by any means. I'm here representing myself as an educator. I'm teaching an ethics in communication class over at A&T right now. And so a lot of what I take very seriously is my role as an educator to really activate these young people to care enough about civic engagement to pursue law or to pursue understanding more about law enforcement. And so, working at a historically Black university, and teaching a class related to ethics, obviously issues like law and policy come up really consistently. These young people, I can tell you from having taught at both UNCG, A&T, and GTCC, they are curious and they want to get so much more engaged in what's going on the civic side because they see how it impacts their lives. When we talk about unconscious bias, I love when people give examples, and so I'll kind of follow suit by sharing examples of my own. I was born in Swaziland, which is a small African country. And so when I came to Greensboro as a 4-year-old little girl, I was hit in the face immediately with implicit bias based on what Black Americans felt about Africans based on mainstream media, what white Americans perceived Africans to be based on stories and mainstream media. And so when we talk about bias, it's this inclination to have a belief about an individual based on, bits and pieces of information without necessarily knowing who that individual is. And so organizing people in that sort of a way in and of itself is not necessarily a bad thing. I share that with my students all the time because we have to organize people in order to make sense of the world around us. So, as a college professor, my students know not to cuss at me, for example, so we organize relationships and individuals in a particular kind of way. Well, biases begin to become problematic when we disengage our human ability to be able to like parse out the information that we have about our feelings, our emotions, our thoughts. Sunny, you mentioned that I've done training with law enforcement. Most recently, I did, pardon me, an emotional intelligence training with the Salisbury Police Department. My PhD is in leadership studies. And so a lot of the work I do is with organizational leaders who are wanting to transform the way that they lead, acknowledging things like biases so that they can be prepared for what the future of leadership looks like. And so when we talk about conscious versus unconscious, the conscious bias is the blatant racist. I got a chance to participate in a protest in Graham back in July. And when we curved around the corner, y'all, there were white supremacists there waving their Confederate flags, blatantly saying, "We used to own you, you don't belong here." That's a conscious bias. That is an intentional exertion of, I think I am better than you, and I'm going to do that intentionally. Those are the people who, you know, we can guard and protect ourselves from because we don't have to guess where they stand with us. The dangerous area is the unconscious bias. And again, this is something we talk about with the students all the time. And what that is it's the year after year, the moment after moment of messaging that comes by way of lessons in elementary school that make the white guy seem like the hero, or the, you know, programs in school that always seem to lean toward the Black kids with the drugs, or, you know, it's not something that is necessarily as blatant. And because it isn't blatant, we've got people who are in positions of enormous influence who are making bad policies and not enforcing them, and who are making bad laws on the basis of a belief that they might genuinely believe is real. That's the scary part, you know? It's unconscious. They don't realize that it's untrue. But I care a lot about truth, and a lot of my teaching style, my communication style has to do with understanding individuals and their stories, because you know, the only way that we're able to evolve, in my belief, this is my humble opinion, the way that we're going to be able to evolve beyond unconscious biases so that we can begin to lead in a way that is more just and more fair, is actually like take the time to see who we really are. I mean, even race as a social construct, I can't get into all that. The president says we can't talk about critical race theory anymore, you know, but critical race theory, it's a foundational theory in higher education that helps us as students and educators to understand what's going on here. This didn't just pop up. We ought not be mystified about the fact that Black people are disproportionately affected by bad laws and unenforced policies. The country was rooted in that. The origin of the police were people who were hired to go find enslaved people who are running away. And I have a bit of a problem with, I don't like to put a lot of fluff around the reality of what's going on. And so my students tend to appreciate it. Some of the leaders might not. So hopefully we'll find some peace in the middle maybe. But yeah, I mean, it's again, that the view that we have of other people that impacts decisions that cause unnecessary suffering. And it's really based on lies.
Well, to follow that up, I do want to ask Attorney Pritchett. Attorney Pritchett, can you tell us from your experience as even being a prosecutor before, how do you see unconscious bias play out in the courtroom? And I mean, like, what can we do about that?
That's a difficult question, particularly when people are unaware that they have these biases. Yeah. And you see it from the treatment of minority lawyers, from some of the court personnel, sometimes from the judges towards the minority lawyers. I mean, it's just rampant, and you know it when you see it. And I mean, we could have sensitivity training. I don't know what that would necessarily do, because these are good and grown folks who have practiced what they believe for years and years, and they could fake the funk if you put them in a class, but deep down the core of them is still likely to be the same. And I don't know. I mean, I'll just give you one little example. A bailiff came up to me and wanted to have a discussion about Black Lives Matter. and how, you know, communists started it and they're Marxist, and what do you think about Black Lives Matters? I think all lives matter, and so on and so forth. And I just totally, you know, I don't know what to say.
Well, Councilman Outling, on a local level, I'm sure that when it comes to decisions that you all make and things that you talk about, you see this all the time as well. Is there something that can, is there some way of, again, holding someone accountable, even though they can't see it? Well, what's your stance on this? What's your perspective?
There's a little bit of that, and I could certainly trade stories with the other attorneys about unconscious bias in judges. I recall when I was in South Carolina for a case, a senior law partner and I went back to the chambers, you know, private area, essentially the judge's office, had a good discussion with opposing counsel, came to some sort of resolution on an issue, and then all of the attorneys before me were all white, and they all shook the judge's hand and then left the chambers. When it came my turn, the judge all of a sudden wanted to give me a fist bump. So, you know, one of those situations, to Jan's point, where, you know, I don't think the judge was doing that with conscious, deliberate malice, but obviously he viewed me to be different and somehow thought that a fist bump was appropriate for me, whereas it wasn't for my colleagues or any of the other attorneys in the room. To your point about, you know, where does that leave us? What can we possibly do, especially on matters that might actually involve life or death? It actually goes to your first point. It's policy and law. You can develop and enact policies and laws that prohibit actual actions and don't depend on somehow figuring out what someone's mental state was. By way of example, earlier this summer or spring, about a week before the horrific killing of George Floyd, there was an issue on the A&Y Greenway in Greensboro in which a young Black boy was stopped on the Greenway. Come to learn that it was pursuant to a call that was made to Guilford Metro 911. In the call, a lot of information was provided. What wasn't provided was really any physical description information aside from arguably the person's skin color. So no information was provided as to the person's build, no information was provided as to the person's height, no information was provided as to the person's weight. And so what happened was, call was made into Metro 911, this child was stopped. And so clearly, as a legal matter, as the law exists right now, it's a legally valid stop. You know, no one acted in violation of the law making that stop. But it raised a whole host of questions about what's the policy, what's the standard? Because if you can act and stop someone where you're only providing really race or color of skin as a basis for the stop, or do we have different standards? Because under that standard, a 16-year-old boy could be stopped, Shaquille O'Neal can be stopped, I can be stopped, Morgan Freeman can be stopped. And you have questions about, well, would we have applied that same standard to everyone across our community? Or would we have said, well, we're in a white area of Greensboro, there's no way we're gonna stop every single white person who happens to be on the Greenway. Let us get some physical description information. And so that's a great example of how you can change policy to make it better or have better outcomes for everyone in our community. Because after this issue arose, I had conversations with staff and Metro 911 and said, well, let's make sure we get more physical description information. The stop was valid, but let's make sure that we're not stopping people unnecessarily so that we're not having every person who may be Black or stick out in that area of town get stopped. And if someone needs to get stopped, it's a much more narrow section or population of the community that's subject to that stop. And so, Sonny, that's a long way of saying in certain situations, we certainly can do things, and that is change policies and change laws.
Okay. And the people who would change the policies and change the laws would be who?
Those are at a local level, your city council person, your county commissioners. At a state level, that's your state representatives, so on and so forth. And I think it's important to also recognize that all of them have a part to play, and in certain areas can, in fact, get better outcomes. So for example, the city of Greensboro several years ago with the prior police chief, he and others worked to develop a policy that is designed to prohibit certain racial profiling that is otherwise allowed under federal law. For example, you have a good legal basis to make a stop of a vehicle, but you wouldn't have made that stop but for the fact that the person was Black or a member of the LGBTQ community. That may be a legal basis that's sufficient for a police stop, but for most people, that's categorically unfair, and that's racialized policing. On a local level, local police department, as a matter of policy, that's prohibited. But that's not prohibited as a matter of state law. It's not prohibited as a matter of federal law. And so if you go outside of the confines of the city of Greensboro and our police department, those are protections that you don't have elsewhere that could be changed by current representatives in our government, but are not in effect right now. And there have been federal laws that are analogous to what we've done here in Greensboro that go back a decade and a half plus. But it goes to, again, the importance of developing good law and policy, moreover, having people who actually want to see those policies and laws enacted.
Thank you, Justin. I appreciate that. I want us to move on to a specific case. Celeste Brandon has a story to tell us about injustice, and I'd like for everyone to listen with an open heart, and we will get advice from our legal experts about her case. Celeste, would you share?
Yes, thank you for having me on here. Thank everyone for joining in. Before I get started, I just want to say I'm a concerned citizen, more so a concerned mother whose daughter did not receive justice. I'm basically going to read you all the letter that I sent out to different individuals and organizations begging for help, begging for my daughter's case to be reopened. And those people that I sent this to are Senator Burr, the North Carolina Department of Justice, Governor McCrory, Mayor Nancy Vaughn, District Attorney Doug Henderson, the North Carolina NAACP State Office, North Carolina Coalition Against Sexual Assault, National Organization for Victim Assistance, Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, North Carolina ACLU, the U.S. Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, Serve Justice via Laura Dunn, BuzzFeed via Tyler Kincaid, and numerous attorneys. So this is basically what I sent them, asking for justice and asking them to reopen my daughter's case. My daughter, who is African-American, was sexually assaulted on the back of her school bus in McLeansville, North Carolina, by a Caucasian student that had been previously reported to the school officials for sexually harassing her. 3 students were called in to corroborate Atlantis' sexual harassment allegation. The student was suspended. After the perpetrator's suspension for sexually harassing Atlantis, he was allowed back on the bus without my daughter's acknowledgement, without contacting my parents, Atlantis' guardians, while I was stationed in Korea, and without any type of mediation with my daughter and the perpetrator before returning to the bus. The day he returned after suspension is the day that he raped my daughter. The assault happened 3 weeks before I was scheduled to return from Korea, and my family and I relocate to Delaware. My daughter disclosed the rape after she had a psychological breakdown and was taken to the emergency room for an examination. This was 10 months after the assault. Before the disclosure, my daughter was not only struggling with the fact that she was raped, she was also struggling with the thought that she was going to die. After he raped her, He laughed and said, I just gave you HIV. He didn't. She's been tested, but that's what he said to her. My daughter at the time was diagnosed with having PTSD, conversion disorder, dissociative disorder, intermittent explosive disorder, anger, anxiety, and major depression. I reported the rape to the Greensboro Police Department and the Guilford County Sheriff's Office. We were assigned a detective. My daughter went to a forensic interview but did not talk. The interview took place before any type of psychiatric counseling was started for her. Approximately a month after the forensic interview, the investigating detective left a message stating that the DA decided not to pursue my daughter's case. I left numerous messages for the detective to call me and explain why the DA decided not to pursue. After the third attempt to reach the detective, I spoke with his replacement, Detective Huckabee, and he told me that Detective Jones no longer works in law enforcement and he was his replacement. Detective Huckabee transferred me to his supervisor, Sergeant Hamlet, and I asked for a reinvestigation and told him what all my daughter has been suffering with, and she will talk now since getting counseling. He said that it's not up to him to reopen the case because DA Kelly Thompson decided not to pursue it. Sergeant Hamlet said that Detective Jones interviewed the perpetrator in Alamance County. I don't know why it didn't happen in Alamance County, it happened in Guilford County. I had no knowledge of this. He said that in the report, Detective Jones stated that Sean, the perpetrator, only held Atlantis's hand and hugged her, and that Sean was a little boy. My dad also went to the sheriff's office pleading that they reopen the case. He was told by Detective Marshall that they couldn't, and that in the state of North Carolina, they don't really look at it as rape because of the age of my daughter and the perpetrator. He also told my dad that it shouldn't have been their district conducting the investigation to begin with. Atlantis has been in and out patient in psychiatric facilities numerous times, has tried to commit suicide numerous times, and she still to this day sees a psychologist and psychiatrist to combat and come to grips with her assault. I've spoken to numerous attorneys to address my daughter's injustice. I had one law firm that agreed to represent my daughter, Lewis and Roberts, Raleigh, North Carolina. 4 months after signing the contract with them, they decided that my daughter's case was too much of a risk for them. That law firm, Lewis and Roberts, and a well-known criminal attorney that they are affiliated with in Raleigh, were both denied any access to the investigative file from Guilford County. They had all my daughter's medical documents. They were ready to push forward with the case. All they was waiting for was the investigative file, and they were denied. So the lawyers basically told us, without the investigative file, we don't have a case. We can't do anything. The investigative file was denied to the only law firm that was willing to help us find peace and justice. There are so many unanswered questions. Why didn't the school officials conduct mediation and contact Atlantis and my parents before Sean was allowed back on the bus? Why is it not really considered rape in North Carolina because of the age? Rape is rape. Why does Detective Jones no longer work in law enforcement? Why was Atlantis' lawyers denied the investigative file for her case by Guilford County? Is the perpetrator receiving any type of psychological help? Because I do not feel that my daughter is the only victim. Why did the wrong district investigate the case? And finally, has Atlantis been denied justice and due process because she is African American and the perpetrator is a Caucasian? And that's Atlantis' story. So like I said, I sent this, I didn't know who to contact. I didn't know what to do. So all the folks that I mentioned to y'all, I reached out to them, with no avail. And, to this day, she is still suffering because I know it's because she's African American, because of the color of her skin.
Thank you for sharing this. And it's really heart-wrenching because, especially with minors, I know it's very difficult in the criminal system. Reverend Allen, maybe this is a question for you when it comes to minors in the criminal justice system. How does this play out when it's a sexual offense?
What was the age of your daughter and the young man at the time the crime occurred?
11, sir.
11. Okay. I would think that what you're really dealing with here, first of all, I'm going to dare tell you that I don't believe it's because your daughter is a Black female. Kelly Thompson is a Black female. She is a Black prosecutor. She prosecutes these cases. So I'm going to tell you, first of all, that if Kelly had the case, it's not because your daughter was a Black female that the case went south, okay? She would be very much an advocate for your daughter because she is a Black female herself. There are a lot of issues here. Some of them are criminal related, others are not. The Guilford County school system is an entirely different setting. What happened there is certainly unfortunate, and for the perpetrator to be put back on the bus, certainly where your daughter had been harassed without any information, certainly does not bespeak common sense. And certainly, I'm sure you would try to address that in the school setting. But that in itself would be a matter of school policy that would be addressed there. As relates to persecution, prosecution, obviously Jan is in the criminal courts every day. This is age 11. Obviously, might have been prosecuted as a juvenile, not as a adult in juvenile court because of the age here of the alleged offender here, and the victim. So that matter could have been adjudicated would be a better word, in the juvenile setting. It would not have been because of the age level, would not have risen to being handled at Superior Court level for disposition. And of course, as relates to the time frame, let's see now, was your daughter's forensic, daughter's was obviously went to the hospital after the incident. And you came back, how long after the incident did you return?
After the incident, it was 3 weeks. 3 weeks.
Okay, you
Incident
came back for
happened.
3 weeks.
Yeah, I came back 3 weeks
Okay.
later.
Now, obviously, one of the things the court does, what happens, I handled I defended, okay, sexual assaults, and one of the key factors is, of course, is the statement from the witness. You had whatever the examination revealed, if they had a rape kit analysis done at the hospital, which should have been done since it was sexual assault. Then, of course, you would have had the forensic interview. Normally, even at the time of the hospital, they should have had someone there, part of the rape assault team, to interview your daughter if possible at that time. But she was so traumatically, may not have been possible to be done. The forensic interview, if your daughter refused to talk at that time, would have hampered certainly the criminal prosecution, or in this case, juvenile prosecution, probably more apt word to use here in that setting. Ultimately, based on whatever information was gleaned, and at that time, your daughter's inability to communicate, based on that information that the DA had to work with at that time, with a review may have taken place with Mr. Henderson, who was the district attorney at that time, a decision was made that they didn't have enough information about the cooperation of your daughter's statement at that time. I understand later on she had counseling and all those things. At that time, they would not have been able to successfully, perhaps, without the assistance of your daughter's aid and testimony as to what happened. They interviewed the other person who may have not been truthful That's a different stuff, part of it. But your daughter was an essential witness, perhaps at that point, to a successful prosecution of the case. And Jan can chime in. I know Jan and I both, I practiced law with the exception of 8 years I was on the bench. I had tried cases for the other 23 years of my practice. And of course, once the DA is an elected official, the DA has the authority and the power to make those kind of decisions. He or she has what's called the decision. They have the power to prosecute or not prosecute a case, and they made that determination early on for whatever reason, and the reasons given probably that the case prosecution of the matter would not be successful at that time. Now, having said that, I also handled civil cases. In other words, I sued people for, and assume that's why you hired Lewis and Roberts, to try to get some justice from the court, the civil court. By that time, your daughter was able to talk about the matter. By that time, you had the psychologists who would have been able to corroborate what your daughter said. By that time, you would have had the medical evidence that would have been able to substantiate, hopefully, I haven't seen the evidence, but perhaps it could have corroborated your daughter's testimony about physical assault taking place, okay? If that, again, I haven't seen it, don't know it, I'm just telling you. Having handled cases as a private attorney, when cases come in your office, you too make an assessment on the whether or not you can recover, because now you're talking about suing for money damages, and the attorneys have to make an assessment economically of whether or not they're going to be able to win. They want to get justice for your daughter, but they got to make a determination as well, unless they're doing it pro bono. Are they going to be able to recover an amount of money that's going to make their effort in their best interest? Now, whether or not there was a statute shielding the disclosure of the information by state statute. I've been away from the law 9 years, so I can't tell you about it. Jan may be able to speak to that issue more pertinently. But there's we kind of saw it recently, where there was a recent effort to get a bill passed in Raleigh to prohibit certain disclosure of certain information. And that bill had been passed, then you couldn't have gotten the autopsy reports, I think it was, from the medical examiner's office. And that would hamper, suing even police officers for wrongdoing, perhaps, and killing folks. And so I don't know whether there's a shield statute there in place, prohibits the disclosure, or whether that was a prosecutorial decision. Maybe Jan can speak to that.
So I apologize for getting up, but this really set forth a really intriguing issue. And I went to get one of my books just to look it up. I've never heard of an 11-year-old rape case, and there's a reason why. It doesn't look like we have anything on the books to cover that. Most of these statutes have an age requirement that the defendant be at least 12 was the youngest age that I could find. But oftentimes the perpetrator or the defendant has to be 4 years older than the victim. And, this is something that's profound. Celeste, your situation, your daughter's situation is something that should lead to the passing of a law to cover this conduct, particularly as children now see more and more on TV and YouTube. I don't think this is going to be isolated. There's going to be another 11-year-old victim, a 10-year-old victim, where someone is imitating something that they've seen that they shouldn't have seen. Unless I overlooked it, I just don't see any particular law that covers this situation. But one thing that Steve said, even if it had, you can't bind an 11-year-old over to Superior Court, even if we could find a felony. So what would happen is that case would be handled in juvenile court. And they used to have a program called the STOP program in juvenile court for young for children that engaged in sexual activity with other children. It was therapy and classes and trying to get them to learn about their behaviors and to modify their behaviors. But I think it's this is something that should lead to legislators in Raleigh codifying something that would cover this conduct. And you might, Gladys Robinson was supposed to be here tonight. She's a state's, well, of course, I think she couldn't be here tonight, but she's someone that you could contact. You could contact your local representative in the House of Representatives for your district. But I really think that that her pain may help someone in the future.
And let me just clear up one thing. That Senator Robinson was not aware of a request for her to participate in this program. There was a miscommunication perhaps between me and the moderator. So the Senator Robinson's only indication, I had contacted Senator Robinson to help me address some of the questions that had been originally sent out. And so she was not privy to any knowledge that she was being requested to participate in this program.
Okay, I'm sorry about that.
I just want to clear it up.
Yes,
I don't want anybody to think Gladys had no knowledge of a request for her to participate. But Senator Robinson graciously assisted me in trying to make sure that I was accurate in terms of some of the North Carolina laws and policies and statutes and the way these laws were adopted here in North Carolina. So let that be clear on the record. Okay.
Yes. And I love Senator Robinson. I love her daughter, Ladisa. And so, that was miscommunication between Reverend Allen and I threw it out there. Anyway, so now that you've said that, Jan, about this case being like no other case, how do you go about, I know you were saying, to talk to the senator and the House of Representatives, who actually would be that person to help her make that precedent? Is it someone that could represent her to do that, or does she have to be that individual that needs to go and talk to people? Like, how does she go about that?
Well, when you talk about Senator Gladys Robinson, she certainly has an open door. She is active in our legislature. She would take this matter to heart. She's a caring person. As you said, she has a daughter. I have two daughters. I'm sure that it's something, it's just shocking. And I think that you could shop it to any senator, but certainly because Senator Gladys Robinson is right here in our backyard, I think that if she heard the story, she would get something, she would at least propose some legislation to address it.
And let me say this, it may not have been a rape charge that could have been prosecuted, but there should have been some type of a battery or assault charge possible.
Sexual battery is the only thing I can think of, and that's a misdemeanor. So
yeah, but I'm just saying the rape itself may be legally barred by age, and that would be a reason why you couldn't prosecute it for rape. But again, I'm saying there are, if somebody touches you improperly, that's an assault. So again, it's just a matter. And again, looking at some of the comment, one of the questions, when you say someone's indicated that they wanted justice here, but when you go to a civil attorney, that's how civil attorneys try to get a measure of justice. There's a difference between what happens in a criminal court, which is one way that justice is meted out, in the civil court. And in the civil court setting, the only way one can get a measure of justice is through the return or recovery of money, okay? And that's what people sue in civil courts for. So for instance, we saw in Louisville, Kentucky, where Breonna Taylor suffered, Breonna Taylor died. And the grand jury, and that's being exposed now, did not return a indictment against the police officer. But the city of Louisville entered into a civil settlement of money to try to give the family that measure of justice. Now, can't bring beyond the back, but the family received $12 million, which I understand is one of the highest settlements to receive. Was it 20 million? It might have been 20 million, whatever it was. It was a sizable amount. So that's why you have to understand which court you're in and what can that court do.
Thank you, Reverend Allen. And just to piggyback off of this, and I really feel like Attorney Pritchett kind of let us know, in a sense, who to talk to about seeking justice on a level where maybe you've never seen something like this before. But for people who are experiencing these everyday crimes, who are of age, and things are happening and they don't feel like justice is being served, what are the steps that people can take, whether it's a crime that has happened to a juvenile or whomever? What is the steps that one should take if they feel like they have not received justice? Councilman Outling, could you tell us, please, your perspective?
Yes, certainly. And certainly Reverend and Allen and Jan could probably speak to this even more ably than I can. But you seek assistance from those who are empowered and actually have the ability to assist and help you get the justice that you seek. So by way of example, if someone feels as though a person should have been charged for a crime, certainly I'm going to be very empathetic and do what I can as a city council member. However, it's beyond the scope of any ability I have to hold someone accountable for a crime that they commit. And so you would really want to be seeking assistance of a district attorney or the like. And so I think depending on what the issue is, you've got to think about who is the actual person or entity that can help give you justice or give you some resolution to your situation. As we've discussed already, however, in many circumstances, not every circumstance, but certainly a possibility, and it certainly happens, where that person, that individual, that entity does not provide the assistance to the person's satisfaction. They don't press charges. And there, really the best mechanism is to advocate for yourself and provide accountability with regard to that person not doing their job. And so we've seen this all across the country with regard to district attorneys who community members feel are unwilling to apply the law equally with regard to officers that violate the law. And those district attorneys refuse to hold the officers accountable for criminal law violations. What communities have done is said, we want a different district attorney that's going to apply the law to officers as well. And so really that's kind of in the most basic sense, the line of accountability and the mechanism to get movement forward on issues that might concern people.
Thank you. Attorney Pritchett, did you have anything else to add to this about the process in which people should seek justice?
And I think Justin hit it on the head. First, you identify the problem and then determine the correct person or agency to report it to. One of our previous discussions getting ready for this, if a motorist were stopped for registration and an officer said they smell weed and searched the car, tore it up, and they found nothing, and this person doesn't smoke marijuana, has never had anyone in their car that smokes marijuana, that person might, and this is just an example, that person might want to go and get a drug test and then complain to internal affairs at the police department that they were treated inappropriately by an officer who just wanted to search their car. So if you were stopped by the Greensboro Police Department, you certainly could report any misconduct to internal affairs. And Justin, one of the things that you certainly would be aware of is about the Citizens Review Board. I wasn't sure if it's still up and running, but that's something that perhaps you could shed some light on.
Yeah, certainly. That's an excellent thought and point, Jan. With regard to the city of Greensboro and the conduct of its police department, there's an internal review process to what Jan said about an internal affairs, essentially, if a complaint is received. If the person is not satisfied with the determination of internal affairs, they can appeal that decision essentially to a board of community volunteers who evaluate the issue and determine whether or not police department policies were violated. If they're not satisfied with that determination, they can always appeal it further to the police chief or the city manager. And ultimately, they can always make appeals of the city council to act, although that's a much more kind of extraordinary, laborious type event. But within the city of Greensboro, we have a process by which people can make complaints and appeal decisions that they find to be unsatisfactory.
With the citizens panel, whenever they come up with a decision, is that decision held? Like, what happens when they come up with a decision? If they say that this police officer needs to be reprimanded, what happens after that?
Yeah, great question. And so that would go to the chief of police for him or her to make the determination. Notably, the really significant thing here that I think many people would be surprised to understand is that there are very, very few complaints that are ever filed. Also, when those complaints are filed, as a general matter, the volunteer board or administrative levels below it determine that officers haven't engaged in misconduct. Now, that doesn't mean that they are necessarily correct, but it's important to understand that first, an avenue of filing a complaint exists. Moreover, again, when there are unsatisfactory results, there's generally always a level that you can appeal the matter to next, ultimately ending with the city council. Now, in recognition of the reality that oftentimes those who have been mistreated, the last thing that they want to do is have another interaction with government and perhaps re-traumatize themselves in connection therewith, the city is in the process of implementing a process by which folks can make complaints about officer conduct, raise concerns, short of going through a full complaint process. And so what it looks like is, I don't want to have to jump through the hoops of talking to internal affairs. I don't want to have to give a statement. I just want someone to be aware of this situation that I feel was wrong. The city is now creating a process by which it can evaluate those types of complaints, but those are more designed to improving processes, obviously not adjudicating whether or not an officer engaged in misconduct. In this particular instance, it needs to be held accountable in connection therewith. Now, that certainly may be an outcome, but obviously that's a much less likely outcome if you don't have someone who's going through the process and fully engaging, being willing to provide statements, so on and so forth.
Thank you, Justin. I really want everyone to know that this panel I put this panel together as a follow-up from the police reform, because people wanted to know specifically about the laws and policies that affected them. And with Celeste's case, there has been a question about, is the statute of limitation, has that, I don't know about when it comes to juveniles, but does it have a statute of limitation where she can, I know that this is an unprecedented case, but when it comes to juveniles, is there a statute of limitation? And I don't know if Attorney Outling would be able to answer that, or if I need to give that back to Attorney Pritchett. What did you say?
Yeah, I think Jan is probably best positioned to know that.
Okay, Attorney Pritchett.
So there is a 2-year statute of limitations on misdemeanor. Someone posed the question, and I actually typed a response. so there would be a 2-year statute of limitations for misdemeanors. Felonies don't have a statute of limitations in North Carolina. I actually, because this is so curious to me, I looked at the definition of sexual battery, and that wouldn't apply here because the person would have to be disabled or mentally incapacitated or helpless for the sexual battery to apply. And I'm not certain that that would even work here. And then that would get us all the way down to a simple assault, which is a class 2 misdemeanor that has no teeth. If it's me, I wouldn't consider that justice, a class 2 misdemeanor. And that's why I really think that this is something that that really needs to get some attention, and that we need some new law made.
Okay. As we're getting to the end of our panel, this has been a very enlightening and informative discussion, and I appreciate everyone for being a part of it. And Celeste, I do want to try to get you Senator Robinson's email address and a way for you to actually talk to her after this panel is over. The last couple of questions that we had, and we have just a few minutes left, can each panelist tell the audience one thing they can do to amplify their voice and be heard? And I'll start this off with Dr. Z. Zitty, could you tell us something as a community activist and as a professional PhD, all of the things that you do? Well, what are things that people can do to be heard?
I don't know. I'm still trying to be heard myself. No, I know that there's power in the collective. That's what I would say. I mean, I'm always trying to find ways for everyday citizens and young people to influence what's happening. I'm sitting here listening to all the responses that our attorneys are providing, and I'm thinking, like, how can I use my own position to help push and influence for justice for your daughter, you know? And so for me, I always like to put myself in spaces where I'm learning new information about exactly how things like this work, so that when I do have an opportunity to use my voice, I'm informed, and that I'm not doing what I think I saw Mr. Wright put in the chat, that, you know, that we sometimes have a tendency to only emote, only use emotions, and we're not reliant on data and facts and information and pushing on the basis of that. So for me, you know, I'm a research-based person, so I'm just learning information and then using that information to mobilize masses and mobilize people, so that we can actually leverage that we the people power to make a change. So time will tell.
Thank you. Reverend Allen, I pose that question to you. What can we do to be heard?
I'm glad you did. It's called vote. One of the things we have a great opportunity is to vote. If you have not voted, then you have until November the 3rd. Who sits in office? You talked about laws and policies. People that you elect into the various, whether it be city council, whether it be county commissioners, whether it be school board, state legislature, Congress, you name the office, make decisions that impact your lives and the lives of your children, your mothers, your fathers, your aunts, the whole community. They have the ability to affect your lives from the cradle to the grave. And so one thing we can do is vote. The second thing is you have to be an advocate. You have to speak out against injustices. You have to be willing to be the voice, and you have to speak in reason. And sometimes you can be passionate. I've been guilty. Justin probably should tell you. I've got, sometimes I have a passion about me when I'm trying to advocate for my people. But you have to be passionate, and you have to be rational. You have to be emotional. You have to have your facts, and you have to get the people with you. I can tell you on the if you have a large number of people and you've got the right side of the cause, you will be heard. It's better to go down there with people, whether it's to in the elected forum, public forum, where you can be heard. And then sometimes you have to be in the streets. Sometimes you have to be in the streets, because communities have to sometimes apply pressure. because otherwise people don't hear them. But once you have learned how to speak in whatever form, whatever way it is that you can be heard, you got to show up. You got to be informed, and you have to be able to express what your hurt is and what your ask is.
Thank you, Reverend Allen. I definitely believe you got to show up. And that says a lot, even to Attorney Pritchett's point earlier when he was talking about people serving on jury duty. That is a part of showing up to the polls, showing up for jury duty, showing up to city council meetings, just being involved. Attorney Pritchett, would you like to tell us your perspective of how we can be involved and be heard?
Yes, well, one of the things that I think of is, I think it's incumbent upon us all to start off in the right, and that way we can expose the wrong. I don't say this just to you, I've said it to my clients who are good people. Don't ride down the road smoking weed in your car and then get mad because you got pulled out of the car and your car got searched. Be smarter. Don't cuss a cop out on the streets because they're doing you wrong. Keep your voice and save your voice for the proper forum, because their body-worn cameras are going to show that you were calm while they were mistreating you. So we first have to be right in order to expose a wrong. The second thing that I would say is, not only do we need to vote, but once we vote, the people we voted for, we need to hold them accountable. It's more than voting for someone. Look at what they're doing in their office and hold them accountable. And if they won't work for you, then find somebody that will.
Thank you. That's a very good point. Councilman Outling.
Yeah, that's a perfect point. Look at what they are doing and hold them accountable. We're in the middle of the height, really, of political season, 1 year away or 1 week away from the presidential election. Think about how many ads you heard where politicians talked about the fact that they are racist, or the fact that they are unfair and they believe in unfairness, or that they want there to be unequal outcomes on account of some arbitrary distinction. You do not hear that. And so every politician, every elected official is going to tell you that they agree with common sense moral values. And so accountability can't stop at the campaign pitch that people give you. It can't stop at the advertisement. You have to drill down and look at what are the actual positions that people are taking. Moreover, what are people doing with their time, and what are they actually fighting for, and really, what are they trying to do to make our community a lot better? And so, my suggestion would be, engage more deeply and inform yourself on what's actually happening with regard to those persons who have the awesome responsibility and opportunity to make really important decisions for our communities. And I will tell you, when you do so, you will see actual differences between people who serve in these seats. I'll tell you, even this past year where we were dealing with issues of race, you can look at council members and say, oh, this is a Black council member, I assume their position is going to be this. And it could be patently wrong. And so you have to actually drill down, pay a little bit more attention to what people are doing outside of campaign season, and go beyond the political ads and look at the decisions they're making.
Thank you, Councilman. And Celeste, I know that right now you are waiting for people to hear you. And this panel was one avenue for you to be heard. How do you feel after this discussion tonight?
More informed. There are certain things that I'm still not understanding, but I think that I can have a little closure with it now.
Thank you so much for sharing your story. I know this is very painful for your family. It breaks my heart to hear you going through this, and I hope that you follow Attorney Pritchett's advice and to really amplify your voice in this case and to bring people along with you, because this does seem like an unprecedented case, as Attorney Pritchett was saying, but I'm sure that it is something that happens often and maybe people don't know what to do about it or are afraid to speak up for whatever the reason may be. So thank you for being courageous and telling your story tonight. And again, I want to thank all of the panelists for being a part, all of the viewers for watching tonight. Attorney Allen, if you don't mind, whenever we get off, if you could just give us some little contact information for Senator Robinson so Celeste could send her an email, that would be great. And I just want to thank everyone again. Happy birthday, Reverend Allen. Our next panel discussion will be about real estate inequities. And so we will have Goldie Wells, Marty Cotis, and several other real estate moguls in the city talking about the inequities of real estate and the value of properties. I hope that you'll tune in for that. And thank you for joining us tonight. Celeste, baby, I'll be calling you soon. I love you. And thank you again for joining us. Good night.
Night.